I don't think investment itself has been pulled out necessarily. I think what we're finding is increasing desire to try and understand some of the demands and the needs of the environment, but also the impediments which exist. And some of those impediments are quite simple ones, and a lot of them are around KYC. And KYC, you know your client, and it's all around trying to understand what is the environment in which people are working, and the political influences. You can't ignore that. I don't think there's any impediment when it comes to the exporting of capital to Africa, given the travails which are happening across Europe at the moment. I think what's happening in Russia, you can almost park that separately. In a funny kind of way, you would expect to see a greater investment coming from institutional investors who have got emerging market buckets coming back to Africa in scale, because there's nothing available for them in Europe. Russia, as we all know, there's very little you can do because of sanctions. There's not an awful lot of appetite, demand across Central and Eastern Europe. And the only other emerging market which is absolutely flourishing at the moment but has very limited debt requirement is Turkey. So Africa itself becomes a very attractive proposition. So I'm not seeing that what's happening in Russia as being an issue itself. What I think is a greater issue is the very nascent economic environment that we have across Europe. Clearly that has a huge impact on what is happening in Africa. And so that is, for us, probably a greater concern than anything else. And don't forget, Europe, in its different guises, is going through political reforms, political changes, elections, etc. So their concentrations are perhaps more around themselves at the moment, rather than looking outside of Europe itself. So what we need is a huge amount of economic reform in Europe before we start to see it translate into greater economic stability and growth across the emerging markets. So if we're geographic to Southern Africa, I would actually look at Africa, and I've split it up a little bit. First of all, Southern Africa, for me, is almost like Europe. You're sitting in a banking environment which is one of the most highly regulated environments in the world. It's recognized as such. And if we then look at the banking environment north of South Africa, it is also very partitioned. The South African banks have always had great access to both bond and loan markets. And they've always created a good balance between the two markets, because it's important that any institution has a varied access to capital and to liquidity. I don't think that we have seen any slowdown whatsoever. Yes, we've had the impact of a bank failure here, Africa Bank, for instance. But what that has really told the world is how very, very strong the resolution directive is through the curatorship. And I think the rest of the world, by the way, has an awful lot to learn from that. That has probably slowed down some of the investor appetite, just simply because they don't understand or know. But that's an issue which I think the SARB will have to address in terms of how it translates that into public information. Obviously, it's still too early because they're working still through resolution. I don't think that we've seen any slowdown whatsoever, and I'll come back to a point I mentioned earlier on. With the cessation of available investment opportunities across many of the emerging markets, Africa still presents itself with a huge opportunity. Number one, because it's very, very well governed, the financial institutions, and number two, there has been very little failure itself, and where there has been failure, there's been resolution. I think the Middle East, there's always going to be a huge amount of opportunity, particularly in loan and bond. Not so much on what we would call classic infrastructure in the Middle East. I think an awful lot has been done, and there's a lot of refinancing to be done across the Middle East. Europe is still very much a M&A market, where a lot of the bond and loan opportunity will come through jumbo-type financing. For the rest, it's all vanilla, plain refinancing. Across Africa, there's still a huge demand for infrastructure-type financing. It's colossal. And as we've heard today, for instance, from the Minister, and under the National Development Plan, even here in South Africa, there's a huge amount of financing still required. If you just take the Inga project in the DRC, for instance, which is going to generate something like 4,500 megawatts of energy, that is a project which is going to be tens of billions of dollars in scale, and that's going to need financing. So in terms of opportunity and exciting financing opportunities, both at the bond and loan side, it's going to be colossal. But the loan market's going to have to play a very, very large part in that, because as we all know, project financing needs loan funding first, and then it is refinanced in the bond market. So all the markets are going to have to work together. And it's not just going to be Europe, it's not just going to be the United States, it's not going to just be the development agencies, but there's going to have to be a lot of intergovernmental working together as well, and also financing from state. It can't just be the private sector, it will also need to be the public sector. We have been following the GFC events for many, many years. And this is not a sales pitch, but we actually rather enjoy the way they're organized. We enjoy the people who are behind them and their ability to actually listen to the sponsors in terms of the design and the construct. There are one or two events which, for me, stand out. And I do believe it is this one in South Africa and also the one in Turkey, where you have the ability to bring something relevant which people do not know about, the content. There's others, for instance, like in the Middle East, in Dubai. It's a great event, but it's a social event. In fact, the content itself, everyone already knows. And if you don't know it, well, you shouldn't be doing your job that you're doing. That's my view. So I think it's all down to what do you bring which is additional. And I think that's what this event has brought over the last day and a half, 2 days. It's brought something additional. I wouldn't actually isolate any one as being more relevant than the other, because they all fill different intellectual questions. I think, listening to the gentleman yesterday from Angola, Angola is, I think, a very challenging environment for everyone, and I think everyone needs to try and understand it a bit more. The same thing for Senegal. If there was one thing I would have liked to have heard more of, is more around Central and perhaps even Eastern Africa. We had a very heavy content coming from the Western, nothing from the Maghreb. But I guess that we can address the Maghreb probably through the Middle East content. But I think Africa is still one continent, and it would be probably, I think, for the next event, to have a balance between the continents itself and not just to Sub-Sahara and not to West Africa. So everything I heard has all been absolutely terrific. I'm not a fan of panels necessarily. I think sometimes you need to break away from the panel format and have some almost lecture style format, and perhaps something which is slightly more inquisitive as well. Because I think to ask people to sit down for almost 2 days and hear the same format repeatedly, goodness me, it can be rather tiring, and you need to find a way of keeping people in the room rather than finding reasons for them to be outside socializing. So, but that's me. I mean, I have chaired these things many times, and we can see the challenge of doing that. It's like herding cats. It's almost impossible.